oh, we're missing 5 tons of highly enriched uranium and plutonium.
That's,
You didn't know that, did you?
I heard about that, actually.
Did you? Yeah, that's actually true. I found the GAO and started digging through there, and I actually wrote a piece. That one's on the chanceaddison.com site under nuclear versus PV. And towards the end, the very end section of that, there's a debate between myself and Congressman Fleming. And then following that, there's a section on the GAO where, a lot of these issues I ran through and posted a bunch of links to exactly what the reports are saying, and then also made a list of the ones which have received no action. And we're talking stuff like, okay, we're missing 5 tons of plutonium and uranium, no action taken. We're wasting $30 billion a year over here, no action taken. We have nuclear reactors that are, aging out, and we need to step up our cleanup efforts because we have thousands of people dying. No action. It's just, there's a stunning amount of things that are seriously wrong, and the GAO seems to be like the most honest of government agencies, because the stuff that they are telling us about our government is like holy. It's just amazing. It's if you really want to see examples of government dysfunction, the last couple of pages of that 45-page spewage of sarcasm, it has the section on the GAO. So there's actually the sarcasm-free and the sarcasm-rich version. The sarcasm-free version is just a quick table showing some spending estimates and actual numbers, depending on the agency, because some agencies have their spending clearly declared and some don't. So, like a really weird example, domestic preparedness for nuclear spending, the estimate that I finally did find, you would probably be surprised to learn that I found it in the FDA reports, of all places. You'd think that would be in the DHS, like, Department of Homeland Security, or, somewhere, NNSA, something like that. And where did I find it? The FDA, where they're saying, this was back in 2001, right shortly after 9/11, I believe. The agency released a report, and in it, they estimated that domestic preparedness for CBRN events, which, chemical, biological, nuclear, radiation, that type of thing, that those estimates suggested that $54 billion for a 10-year period would be required for domestic preparedness. And that jived perfectly with what I found in agency reports, in terms of that being a very reliable estimate from 10 years prior when compared to the data that I found. And it's, none of it's straight up declared. They made it hard to dig through and find. I had to scan like 10,000 pages to find what I was looking for, which was specifically, in a lot of agency reports, a line item entry regarding a specific type of spending, which sometimes would be labeled in such a fashion as to hide the fact that it's actually CBRN spending. In an EPA report, I found that type of spending hidden in the Clean Air Program or something like that. They don't just come out. If you want to know what they're actually spending on that stuff, you can't just find the data. You actually have to dig around, and it's not designed to be easily located and calculated.
Mm-hmm.
So, consequently, when I constructed that piece of work, it's just peppered with links instead of putting them all at the end and, making you bounce back and forth. And I've had people complain about the readability because of this. I chose to just put it in the text. That way, when you read a paragraph, if it requires a link to something, it's there. And that particular report, the nuclear versus PV report, has probably more than 100 links and most of them are to agency reports. And the data that I used on the nuclear industry to provide certain economic numbers was provided by the industry itself. So, you'd have to say, how are they going to dispute those numbers? Those are the ones they're giving us. Same with the government number. While those might not be accurate, who's going to have a better handle than the government? I mean, you really going to trust a partisan, organization that has a clear agenda or an undisclosed agenda? Either way, they have an agenda that is, they're trying to affect some sort of change, and usually they're being funded by somebody telling them what the message is going to be. Versus the agency reports where somebody in office is legally required to make sure that those reports comply to at least some standard of accuracy, and they can actually face some pretty serious penalties if that isn't achieved. So, where are you going to go for those numbers and have any trust? Anywhere? I mean, in the world, none of it's totally solid. But for me, I'll use the information that is guaranteed that, somebody's ass is on the line, that they could go land in jail if it's falsified, versus a privately funded organization, a partisan organization that has no responsibility in such a fashion, versus the standard held by a government official. While they don't get punished very severely usually, the standard for conviction, the code of ethics within the profession, is higher than that of the people operating in the private sector. To me, the agency data seem to be the stuff that would make sense when looking for a description of government spending. So that's why it's got all those links, and the majority of them are directly to agency data. And it turns out that if you were to subsidize the entire economy at the same level to which we now subsidize the nuclear industry, federal spending would be about 300% larger than it is today. We do that through $17 billion a year straight up declared in the DOE budget in terms of cleanup and all the different activities, the regulation and monitoring. And they've got a research budget in the DOE of about $4.8 billion a year. But when you look at where the agency spending is focused, it becomes very clear that a good portion of that money, which is not disclosed as to how they're exactly spending it, but it has to be that a good portion of it is focused in the nuclear industry in terms of either developing new technology for generation or cleanup, because they have, $4 or $5 billion a year worth of spending dedicated to cleanup, and then you've got another 6 federal agencies that each spend more than $1 billion a year. And you've got some strange ones. Like most people don't understand that the Department of Justice and the Department of Labor are both spending a significant amount of money every year on legislation that was enacted via the fact that individuals' constitutional rights had been violated by either industry practice or intentional government exposure during the brief period after World War II, when we apparently needed that kind of data and had to throw our best and brightest out there, and consequently made 400,000 veterans really ill. And so that eventually ended up creating legislation about 20 years later where the Department of Labor and the Department of Justice and several other agencies are involved in distributing payments to people that were made sick by either above-ground testing or, intentional exposure. These veterans are called atomic veterans. That's the little nickname they picked up. And a variety of other issues where, there'll be industry issues and the workers get sick, and then we, the taxpayers, end up footing the bill because the companies will go out of business, and then the assets get sold off to a new entity, and the new entity has no liability for the sick employees from the prior business. So then that ended up creating a group of former employees that were sick and had no coverage, and they ended up coming after the government, and that created, another program where sick people are getting taken care of with U.S. taxpayer dollars, while the industry, the nuclear industry, was privatized and sold off into the public sector. And then, these issues arose where workers would get sick, and because these operations were publicly traded companies, they could therefore fail. The assets would be sold at pennies on the dollar, the obligations would be absorbed by the U.S. government, and the cycle repeats. And that's occurred. And that's where the level of subsidies were created. And then you got a lot of other hidden spending, like in Medicare, Medicaid. You have not Social Security specifically, other than survivor benefits or disability, but in the medical spending, Medicare and Medicaid. Statistically, if you compare the rise in the 12 major cancers that are covered by government legislation regarding industry exposure and such, and you only take the top 6 of those, and then compare the rise in rates to government spending in Medicare and Medicaid, it becomes clear that we're talking trillions of dollars worth of our debt, our accumulated national debt, actually came in the form of little chunks every year since 1965, when those two programs were created, spent on the fact that 1% or 2% rise here or there in these 6 major cancers that I used alone generated $1 billion here, or a few million there, and lo and behold, when it starts to grow over time as the spending in these programs has increased, then statistically the math shows that I think the calculation that I had come up with is like $2 trillion worth of our current $16 trillion debt comes in the form of increased cancer rates via exposure to nuclear materials that are then paid for by U.S. taxpayer dollars in the form of Medicare and Medicaid spending. Most people don't know that. But the math is there. It makes sense. All the links, it sounds friggin' crazy, but if you go through step by step in those sections and follow the links, then it's suggests that at least some amount of money, a significant amount of money in terms of the debt that we carry, is due to the fact that people get sick from exposure to radiological material. And that, loose industry practices in the past and accidents that could have been prevented by more efficient and effective regulation caused a lot of economic harm. It's a perfect backdrop against the recent accident in Japan where, estimates of the total cost over time with the increase in medical spending and the cleanup and all the economic damage done by the fact that Japan was so reliant on nuclear energy at the time, the calculations run in the multiple trillions of dollars in terms of the total cost. So there's one part of our problem. It's not the whole solution, but considering the fact that all those things are true, the privatization, the healthcare costs, the subsidies, all those issues, that doesn't even address the security concerns. You're talking about tens of billions of dollars a year in federal spending to subsidize an industry. And by doing so, by picking up the tab, by letting the U.S. taxpayer do that, the industry is then able to turn around and claim to the public that the price of nuclear electrical generation is half the price of anything else. Well, the whole industry is only about $50 billion a year, and if we're spending $30 billion worth of our tax dollars, well, you add that to the actual cost, and then it becomes clear that nuclear electrical generation is actually more expensive. But because they don't have to pick up the tab on the healthcare costs and the security and the cleanup, then all of a sudden they can say that it only costs 50% of what solar costs. But it's not true.